In the middle of an emergency board meeting at Harrington Global, CEO Victoria Harrington coldly fired Caleb Ward for stealing confidential files. There was no explanation offered and none accepted. The single father simply set his employee badge on the polished table and turned toward the door without raising his voice. But before he stepped out, Caleb paused beside Victoria and whispered 4 words that would haunt her for months to come. "Don't trust your own family." The room erupted in quiet laughter, and her older brother smiled as though he had already won. 10 minutes later, a hidden transfer of $30 million left the company under Victoria's own signature, one she never remembered giving. If you want to know whether Caleb is protecting Victoria or setting a trap of his own, tap subscribe now and stay for the secret that changes everything by the end. The emergency meeting had been called on the top floor of the Harrington Global Tower, where floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the gray skyline of Philadelphia, and the boardroom smelled faintly of expensive coffee and cold tension. Caleb Ward was escorted in without warning, still wearing the same gray suit he had worn to every internal audit meeting for the past 6 years, his expression unreadable as he took in the faces arranged around the table. Victoria sat at the head, flanked by her older brother Graham and her mother Eleanor, while a dozen board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Graham stood first, tapping a remote that lit the screen behind him with a spreadsheet of download logs, each line stamped with Caleb's employee credentials. The logs showed a strategic acquisition plan for a regional shipping company, a list of Harrington Global's most valuable clients, and internal financial records belonging to the Harrington Family Trust. Worse still, fragments of that same data had already surfaced in the inbox of one of the company's fiercest competitors, a detail Graham delivered with theatrical disappointment rather than genuine surprise. Victoria asked Caleb directly whether he denied it, her voice level, but her eyes searching his face for some flicker of guilt she expected to find. Caleb answered without flinching, saying the data had passed through his account but that he had never been the one to use it, a distinction he repeated calmly even as Graham scoffed from across the table. Graham accused him of stalling for time, insisting that no innocent employee needed such careful phrasing to explain himself. Eleanor leaned forward with the practiced gentleness of a woman who had spent decades softening hard decisions, urging her daughter to act decisively before the family's reputation suffered further damage. Victoria, caught between the pressure of the room and the coldness required of her title, announced Caleb's termination effective immediately and slid across a non-disclosure agreement tied to a generous severance package. Caleb read it once, then pushed it back across the table, declining the money and the silence it was meant to purchase. He collected nothing but his coat. As he reached the door, Caleb slowed just long enough to lean toward Victoria, his voice low enough that only she could hear it clearly. "You just trusted the wrong person," he said. "Don't trust your own family." Graham let out a short laugh and told the room that a desperate man would say anything to plant doubt on his way out, and several board members chuckled along with him, eager to move past the discomfort of the moment. Caleb didn't look back. He walked out through the glass doors of Harrington Global, with the quiet composure of a man who had expected this outcome long before it arrived, leaving behind a room that assumed the matter was closed. 10 minutes after Caleb left the building, Victoria's phone buzzed with an automated notification from the finance department, confirming a transfer of $30 million, authorized under her own digital signature. She frowned at the screen, certain she had approved nothing of the kind that morning, and certainly nothing during a meeting where her full attention had been fixed on firing a man she barely knew. She had been sitting in that boardroom the entire time, phone untouched, hands folded in her lap as she watched Caleb Ward walk away. Whatever had just happened, it had happened without her. Victoria immediately called the finance department, demanding they freeze the transfer before it cleared, but the response that came back only deepened her unease. The chief financial officer explained that the funds had already fractured into several smaller transfers, each routed to a different consulting entity within minutes of the original authorization. Graham was quick to place blame, reminding the room that Caleb still had system access privileges until his credentials were formally revoked, and that a man freshly humiliated in front of the board had every reason to want revenge. Victoria wanted to believe him, if only because the alternative felt too unsettling to consider, but a small detail nagged at her. The transaction had been authenticated using a device physically located inside her own private office, a room she had not entered since early that morning. She pulled the hallway security footage herself, scrolling through timestamps with Miles Keene standing quietly beside her, and neither of them found a single person entering her office during the window when the transfer occurred. Graham suggested the system logs were simply glitching and pressed Victoria to sign an emergency resolution granting him temporary control over all financial operations until the confusion was resolved. She nearly agreed, exhausted and rattled, her pen already hovering over the signature line, when Caleb's whispered warning surfaced again in her mind uninvited. She asked, almost offhandedly, who had first flagged Caleb's account for unauthorized downloads. Graham answered that cybersecurity had sent the report directly to him, a claim that seemed reasonable until Victoria requested to see the original file herself. What arrived in her inbox was a plain document with no digital signature from any actual security analyst, no case number, and no chain of custody that would normally accompany an internal investigation of this severity. Miles Keene, the longtime outside counsel who had served on Harrington Global's board for over a decade without ever belonging to the family, quietly pointed out that company policy required an independent investigation before any termination of this magnitude. Eleanor waved off the concern with practiced impatience, warning that hesitation now would only make the board doubt Victoria's ability to lead. That night, alone in her office long after the building had emptied, Victoria asked her assistant to pull every report Caleb had filed over the past month, half expecting to find nothing unusual. The search returned empty results, as though his recent work history had simply been erased. But buried deeper in her own calendar archive, in a section she rarely opened, she found a meeting request Caleb had sent weeks earlier, titled Discrepancies in Payments Linked to the Harrington Family Fund. The meeting had never taken place. It had been canceled from her own account, though Victoria had no memory of ever seeing the invitation, let alone declining it. Caleb returned that evening to the modest house he had lived in for the past decade, a world away from glass towers and boardroom politics, where the porch light flickered and the mailbox leaned slightly from years of harsh winters. He hung up the same gray suit he had worn that morning and set an unopened cardboard box of personal belongings on the kitchen table, unwilling yet to face what it represented. His phone rang before he had even taken off his shoes, and he saw his daughter Rowan's name on the screen, calling from her dormitory 2 hours away. He answered with forced calm, telling her only that he had lost his job, careful to keep the details vague enough that she wouldn't worry more than necessary. Rowan, sharp as always, heard something beneath his measured tone and asked directly whether he had actually done what they accused him of. Caleb answered simply. "No," he said, "but sometimes the truth arrives slower than the accusation." Rowan, 20 years old and studying architecture, had grown up watching her father navigate quiet dignity through difficult years, first through her mother's illness and now through this. She urged him not to sign anything just to preserve a reputation that didn't need saving in the eyes of the people who actually mattered. After the call ended, Caleb opened a small fireproof safe hidden in his closet, retrieving a folder he had prepared weeks earlier without telling anyone at the office. Inside were case numbers he had submitted to an outside auditing firm, timestamps documenting a pattern of irregular transactions, and a list of 7 consulting companies that had been quietly draining money from Harrington Global for years. Everything Caleb had kept was carefully chosen to avoid any accusation of impropriety. He held no confidential company files, no proprietary documents, nothing beyond timestamps, case reference numbers, and publicly available business filings anyone could request through the state registry. This distinction mattered enormously because it meant every piece of evidence he possessed had been gathered through entirely legitimate channels. An envelope arrived by courier just after 9 that evening, bearing the Harrington Global letterhead and containing a substantial severance offer, a non-disclosure agreement, and a clause explicitly forbidding any contact with Victoria Harrington going forward. Caleb studied the paperwork closely and noticed something the board likely hadn't intended him to see: a preparation date stamped days before the meeting that supposedly decided his fate. That single detail confirmed what he already suspected. His removal had never been a spontaneous decision made in the heat of a boardroom accusation. It had been planned, packaged, and ready to deploy well before anyone accused him of anything at all. Caleb sat at his kitchen table for a long while after that discovery, turning the folder over in his hands, thinking not of Harrington Global but of the years before it, when he had built a quiet reputation untangling fraud for companies far less forgiving than the one that had just discarded him. He thought of the promise he had made to himself after his wife's illness, that he would never again let ambition pull him away from the person who needed him most, and how that same promise had made him careful rather than reckless when the irregularities first caught his attention. Caleb picked up his phone again, this time dialing a woman he hadn't spoken to in nearly 2 years. Naomi Price answered on the 3rd ring, her voice carrying the same brisk efficiency Caleb remembered from the years they had worked together, untangling corporate fraud cases long before either of them landed at companies like Harrington Global. She listened without interrupting as Caleb explained everything, occasionally asking a clarifying question that revealed she was already building a mental case file as he spoke. When he finished, Naomi confirmed something that made his stomach tighten. The whistleblower report he had filed 3 days before his termination had nearly been recalled by someone inside the company, an action that required specific administrative privileges few people possessed. Only 3 individuals held the authority to request such a recall: CEO Victoria Harrington, Vice Chairman Graham Harrington, and Honorary Chairwoman Eleanor Harrington. Caleb assumed the trail would lead to Graham, whose motives had seemed obvious from the very first accusation in that boardroom. Naomi paused before delivering the detail that changed everything. The recall request had not come from Graham's credentials at all. It carried the authentication code belonging to Eleanor Harrington's private office, a woman who had spent the entire meeting playing the role of concerned matriarch while quietly pulling levers no one else could see. Victoria used a personal phone unconnected to any company system to reach Caleb 2 days later, requesting a meeting far from the corporate district where no one from Harrington Global would recognize either of them. She chose a small 24-hour diner on the edge of the city, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that never quite tasted fresh, arriving alone and unannounced. Caleb showed up without a laptop or any documents in hand, understanding instinctively that trust would have to be built through words before anything else. Victoria wasted no time with pleasantries, asking bluntly what he had done with the $30 million that vanished under her signature. Caleb didn't react with anger or indignation, only turning the question back toward her with a calm precision that unsettled her more than shouting would have. "Who gave you the evidence against me?" he asked. Victoria admitted that Graham had presented the report, and that Eleanor had been the one pushing hardest for immediate action rather than a careful investigation. Caleb began explaining what he knew about 7 shell companies operating under vague consulting contracts, entities that had collectively received more than $90 million from Harrington Global over the past 3 years, despite having no offices, no employees, and no verifiable services rendered. One of those companies could be traced directly to Graham through a rental agreement on a vacation property, but the remaining 6 had been buried under layers of paperwork designed to obscure ownership far more carefully. Caleb told her he had tried repeatedly to bring this to her attention directly, requesting meetings that were mysteriously canceled every single time until his own account was compromised and used as a conduit for the very data leak he was blamed for causing. Victoria still wrestled with suspicion, wondering whether Caleb was simply using the chaos of her company's crisis to exact revenge for his own humiliation. Caleb didn't try to argue his way past her doubt with more words. Instead, he slid across a printed reference number for the independent audit filing he had submitted days before his termination, proof that his concerns existed on record before any accusation had been made against him. The timing alone dismantled the narrative Graham had constructed, since a man fabricating evidence after the fact could hardly have filed a warning before it happened. Caleb then laid out 3 conditions before agreeing to help her untangle the mess. Conditions he delivered without room for negotiation. No use of Harrington Global's internal systems for their communications, no involvement from Graham or Eleanor under any circumstances, and every piece of evidence gathered would go directly to an independent auditing party rather than staying within family control. Victoria agreed, reluctantly at first, then with growing resolve as she began to understand the scale of what had been hidden from her. Before leaving the diner that night, Caleb asked her one final question that lingered long after he walked out into the cold. Who is the only person who always seems to know what you're about to sign before you've even read it yourself? Victoria sat in silence, unable to answer immediately. But somewhere beneath that silence, an image of her mother's face had already begun forming in her mind, unbidden and unwelcome. Over the following days, Caleb, Victoria, and Naomi built their investigation using nothing but publicly available business filings, careful never to touch anything within Harrington Global's protected systems. They discovered all 7 shell companies shared a single registered mailbox address in Delaware, a common tactic for entities designed to obscure real ownership from casual inspection. Though each company listed different nominal directors, every filing had been submitted by the same law firm, one that had quietly served the Harrington family for well over 2 decades. One entity in particular connected directly to Graham, its payments covering a lakeside vacation property and regular private jet charters that far exceeded his declared income. Victoria initially convinced herself that Graham alone bore responsibility for the entire scheme, a betrayal painful enough without needing to imagine anyone else involved. Caleb cautioned her against settling too quickly on a single culprit, pointing out that Graham might simply be a beneficiary rather than the architect behind the operation. He reminded her that in every fraud case he had ever untangled, the person who benefited most visibly was rarely the person who had built the structure in the first place, since true architects preferred distance and deniability over easy profit. Victoria resisted the idea at first, insisting it was easier to believe one sibling had betrayed her than to imagine the entire family orbiting around a single hidden hand. Caleb didn't argue the point further, choosing instead to let the evidence continue speaking for itself as it accumulated night after night across 3 laptops spread over Naomi's kitchen table. Naomi traced a portion of the shell company funds into a trust called Havencrest Legacy, its list of beneficiaries deliberately kept private through a separate legal shield. Victoria froze when she heard the name, recognizing Havencrest as the estate where her mother had grown up decades earlier, long before marrying into the Harrington name. She tried to rationalize it away, suggesting someone might have deliberately chosen that name to cast suspicion on Eleanor rather than reveal the truth. Caleb didn't push her to accept anything before she was ready, understanding from painful experience that loyalty often blinds people to evidence sitting directly in front of them. During long nights of digging through filings and financial statements, Victoria began to see Caleb differently than the file that had condemned him ever suggested. She learned he had accepted a role well below his actual expertise years earlier, choosing flexibility over ambition so he could care for his wife during her illness and later raise Rowan alone. Caleb, in turn, began to understand that Victoria wasn't the detached executive the financial press liked to portray, but someone who had quietly kept underperforming factories open specifically to protect thousands of jobs that a purely profit-driven leader would have eliminated without hesitation. This explained, in part, why Eleanor so often described her daughter as too soft for the responsibilities she carried. One evening, Miles Keene reached out to Victoria privately, revealing something he had discovered while reviewing old board records out of simple habit. A resolution passed 6 months earlier had been altered after the fact, its digital version differing from the paper original still stored in his own files. The original document contained no language granting Graham emergency financial authority under any circumstance. The version currently stored in Harrington Global's active system, however, included an additional clause permitting Graham to assume control whenever Victoria was deemed unable to perform her duties as chief executive. Miles confirmed that the digital signature authorizing this change did not belong to Graham at all, but carried the unmistakable authentication of Eleanor Harrington. Just as their private investigation gained momentum, a business publication ran an explosive story accusing Victoria of funneling company funds into personal accounts disguised as consulting fees. Leaked documents accompanying the article bore what appeared to be her own digital signature, and within hours, Harrington Global's stock price began a steep decline that rattled investors across the industry. Graham appeared before cameras almost immediately, expressing solemn concern and promising the family's full cooperation with any investigation, carefully positioning himself as a grieving brother forced into an impossible position. The board called an emergency vote to consider suspending Victoria pending review, and Eleanor privately urged her daughter to step aside voluntarily to protect what remained of the Harrington name. Victoria, cornered and exhausted, confronted her mother directly about the Havencrest Legacy Trust and waited for a reaction that might finally reveal the truth. Eleanor didn't deny recognizing the name, but framed it instead as an old charitable fund the family had maintained for generations, nothing more sinister than sentimental attachment to a childhood estate. She skillfully redirected the conversation toward Caleb, suggesting he was exploiting Victoria's emotional vulnerability for his own benefit, reminding her that he had recently been terminated, that he needed money, and that his connection to an outside auditor should raise serious questions about his motives. Victoria wavered under the weight of her mother's calm insistence, the same voice that had shaped her sense of right and wrong since childhood. Meanwhile, Graham arranged a secretive meeting with Caleb in an underground parking garage, offering him $2 million and a comfortable position overseas in exchange for a signed statement claiming Victoria had directed him to conceal irregular transactions. Caleb refused without hesitation, unmoved by the number Graham kept increasing, as though persistence alone might change his answer. Growing frustrated, Graham let slip that he knew exactly which university Rowan attended, a remark clearly meant to unsettle Caleb into compliance. Caleb's expression didn't change, though something in his voice sharpened as he replied that his daughter was an adult, and that any implied threat toward her would only strengthen the case against everyone involved. Graham backpedaled immediately, insisting he only meant to reassure Caleb that his family would remain safe throughout the process, but the damage to his composure had already been done. Caleb recognized in that moment that Graham was beginning to unravel under pressure he hadn't anticipated facing. When the board finally voted, Victoria was suspended by the narrowest possible margin, and Graham was installed as acting chief executive before the meeting had even fully adjourned. His first act as acting chief executive was to order the complete deletion of every archived audit record within 24 hours, a decision he framed publicly as routine system maintenance rather than what it actually represented. With time running short, Caleb recalled that older audit reports from years before had been preserved in physical form at an off-site storage facility outside the city, a detail few current employees even knew existed. Victoria and Miles drove there together the following morning, racing against the deletion order Graham had issued, uncertain whether the physical archive would still be intact. Inside dusty file boxes labeled with faded ink, they found records dating back to the years when Winston Harrington, Victoria's late father, had personally overseen the company's finances. One folder revealed that Winston had grown suspicious of Graham years earlier, documenting concerns that his son was diverting corporate funds toward private investments without proper authorization. Winston had apparently begun drafting plans to remove Graham from any position involving financial control, a decision he never lived to fully implement. Tucked inside the same folder was a draft of a proposed corporate charter, one that would have fundamentally reshaped how leadership succession worked within Harrington Global. The draft specified that any chief executive would retain the authority to demand an independent investigation whenever irregularities arose, that no family member would automatically inherit executive power simply through birthright, and that leadership must be earned through demonstrated competence rather than bloodline alone. This proposed charter, however, had never actually taken effect following Winston's death, its absence never explained to Victoria during all her years running the company. Miles discovered that the final page of the original document had been quietly replaced with an appendix granting Eleanor sweeping emergency powers under specific conditions. Naomi later confirmed through paper analysis that the ink and stock used for this appendix had been manufactured roughly 2 years after Winston had signed the original charter, meaning it couldn't possibly have been part of his authentic wishes. Victoria stood in that dim storage room, forced to confront the possibility that her own mother had altered her father's final wishes after his death. She thought back to countless conversations over the years in which Eleanor insisted Winston had always intended for Victoria and Graham to share leadership equally, a story she now understood might never have been true at all. Caleb didn't offer hollow comfort or rush to fill the silence with reassurance she wasn't ready to hear. Instead, he told her plainly that discovering a painful truth didn't determine who she would choose to become afterward, only what she now had the chance to build differently. Somewhere in the quiet exhaustion of that storage facility, something between distrust and partnership finally settled into something closer to genuine trust. Caleb admitted, almost reluctantly, that he had nearly abandoned the entire fight weeks earlier, unwilling to drag Rowan through another prolonged battle that wasn't truly hers to carry. Victoria pointed out that he could have taken Graham's money, disappeared quietly, and let the whole situation collapse without him, yet he had chosen instead to walk back into a company that had humiliated him publicly. That single choice, she admitted, was the first thing that had made her genuinely believe him, rather than simply need him to be telling the truth. Buried at the bottom of the final storage box, they discovered a personal letter Winston had written to Eleanor, its ink faded but still legible enough to read clearly. "I know you're preparing to put Graham in Victoria's place," the letter read, dated 6 full years before Winston's death. Victoria chose not to expose everything she and Caleb had uncovered right away, recognizing that if Eleanor and Graham realized how much had already been discovered, they might destroy whatever remained of the hidden network before it could ever be proven. She returned to the family estate and deliberately performed the role of a defeated daughter, apologizing to her mother for ever doubting the family's loyalty in the first place. Eleanor received the apology with practiced warmth, insisting everything she had done throughout this entire ordeal was meant solely to protect the Harrington legacy for future generations. Graham, emboldened by Victoria's apparent surrender, presented her with a formal agreement requiring her resignation as chief executive, a temporary transfer of her voting shares for 6 months, and a promise never to investigate any past transactions again. Victoria told him she needed time to consider it, though privately she had already decided exactly what she intended to do. While she stalled for time, Caleb and Naomi worked quietly alongside an independent committee formed from 3 board members with no family ties to the Harringtons whatsoever. Miles ensured every piece of evidence they gathered followed a proper legal chain, protected against any future accusation of tampering or fabrication. Victoria sent Graham a revised version of the resignation agreement containing one carefully buried clause, requiring all related accounts to be consolidated into a single central fund for audit purposes before any transfer of power could officially proceed. Graham, convinced Victoria had truly given up the fight, skimmed the document without reading closely and signed it without hesitation. Believing his position secure, he ordered the immediate transfer of remaining funds from all 7 shell companies directly into the Havencrest Legacy Trust, unaware that this single order would finally create an undeniable, traceable link between himself and his mother's private accounts. Just as Graham began celebrating his apparent victory, he discovered that Naomi had been in regular contact with Miles throughout the entire process, and panic quickly replaced his earlier confidence. He ordered Victoria's building access revoked immediately, cutting off her ability to move freely through Harrington Global's offices. At the same time, he began assembling a counter-narrative, claiming that Victoria and Caleb had conspired together from the very beginning to seize control of the company through manufactured evidence. Eleanor, sensing the walls closing in around her carefully constructed plan, called Caleb directly and requested a private meeting away from cameras or witnesses. She offered to restore his position and clear his name entirely if he agreed to abandon Victoria before the final confrontation arrived. Caleb asked her plainly why a woman of her stature felt threatened by a single employee who had already lost everything. Eleanor's answer came without hesitation, delivered in the same measured tone she used for every calculated decision. Because people who have nothing left to lose tend to say the things that should have stayed buried forever, she told him. Standing there listening to Eleanor speak, Caleb understood with sudden clarity that she had no intention of fleeing or hiding from what was coming. She intended to walk directly into the final board meeting and position Victoria as the sole architect of the entire scandal, exposing her daughter publicly before anyone could expose the truth first. The final board meeting convened with lawyers, independent auditors, and shareholder representatives, filling every available seat around the long table, tension thick enough to feel in the recycled air of the conference room. Graham spoke first, laying out his case with practiced confidence, accusing Victoria of embezzling company funds, conspiring directly with Caleb, and fabricating evidence purely to reclaim the executive position she had lost. System logs displayed on the main screen appeared to show Caleb logging into Victoria's private account during the exact window when the disputed transfer occurred. Caleb remained silent through the accusation, offering no immediate defense, despite the damning appearance of the evidence being presented. Emboldened by the silence, Graham demanded the board permanently remove Victoria and formally transfer full executive authority to him without further delay. Eleanor rose to speak next, adopting the wounded posture of a grieving mother, forced into an unbearable position, insisting she had only ever tried to shield her daughter from consequences of Victoria's own reckless decisions. Naomi then stepped forward with the results of her independent audit, methodically dismantling every claim Graham had presented moments earlier. The login attributed to Caleb had occurred during a mandatory training session, attended by more than 30 documented witnesses, making his physical presence at any computer impossible. The device used for that login didn't match any hardware Caleb had ever owned or accessed, and the authentication code used to impersonate him had clearly been copied directly from the company's administrative server. Miles then produced both the original paperboard resolution and its altered digital counterpart, laying them side by side for every person in the room to examine. The metadata embedded in the altered file traced the modification directly back to a workstation inside Graham's own office. Graham insisted a technician must have simply used his machine without his knowledge, a defense that grew visibly weaker the longer he repeated it. Victoria then opened the very consolidation clause Graham had signed without reading, projecting it onto the same screen he had used moments earlier to accuse her. Naomi displayed the complete flow of funds, tracing every dollar directly from the 7 shell companies into the Havencrest Legacy Trust in real time for the entire room to witness. Graham, cornered and visibly shaking, could no longer deny that he had personally authorized the final transfer just days earlier, and in desperation he turned on his own mother, insisting he had only followed her explicit instructions from the very beginning. Every head in the room slowly turned toward Eleanor Harrington, waiting to see whether she would deny what her son had just revealed. She did not deny it. Eleanor rose slowly from her seat, straightened the jacket of her tailored suit, and addressed the room with the same composure she had maintained throughout the entire ordeal. "Yes," she said, "I did all of it, and I would do it again to save this company from my own daughter." The room stayed utterly silent as Eleanor spoke, no one quite willing to interrupt a confession delivered with such unnerving composure, as though she were reading from a prepared statement rather than admitting to years of calculated betrayal. Eleanor admitted, without a trace of shame, that she had spent years quietly assembling every piece of this plan long before Caleb ever set foot in the boardroom that started it all. She explained that she believed Victoria cared too much about individual employees, moved too slowly to close underperforming factories, and remained far too soft in negotiations with business partners who deserved no such generosity. Graham, she believed, was willing to prioritize profit above people in ways Victoria never could, which made him the only son capable of steering the company toward the future she envisioned. The money siphoned through the shell companies had never been about simple personal enrichment, though that had certainly been a welcome benefit along the way. It had instead financed the purchase of loyal voting shares, funded the machinery of an eventual takeover, and quietly indebted several board members who now found themselves financially tied to the Harrington family in ways they hadn't fully understood. Eleanor had allowed Graham to believe he would eventually sit at the very top of the company he had helped her seize. In truth, she had always intended to continue controlling every decision from behind him, using her son as a convenient face for power she never planned to relinquish. Graham's expression shifted from panic to something closer to grief as he realized, in front of the entire board, that he had only ever been a tool in his own mother's design. Victoria asked her mother directly whether she had ever truly seen her as a daughter, or only ever as a temporary placeholder keeping the family seat warm until someone more suitable arrived. Eleanor answered without apology, insisting that anyone born into the Harrington name existed first and foremost to serve its legacy above all else. Victoria replied calmly that this exact belief was precisely why the legacy needed to change, immediately and without further compromise. The board proceeded to a vote, revoking every remaining authority Graham had claimed, permanently removing Eleanor from any position of influence within the company and formally reinstating Victoria as chief executive with unanimous support. All relevant financial records were transferred directly to federal investigators for further review outside the company's control. Victoria refused to bury the scandal quietly to protect the family name, choosing instead to release the full findings of the independent audit publicly, despite warnings that the stock price might fall even further as a result. Caleb was formally and publicly cleared of every accusation that had ended his career weeks earlier, his name restored without qualification or hesitation. Graham was escorted from the building alongside his legal counsel, the departure quiet and orderly, without confrontation or spectacle of any kind. Eleanor left the tower in complete silence, her posture unbroken, still apparently convinced that everything she had done had ultimately been justified. As the room slowly emptied, Victoria turned to Caleb and asked the question that had been sitting unspoken between them for weeks. "Why did you warn me?" she asked, "right after I had just destroyed your reputation in front of everyone you worked with?" Caleb considered the question for only a moment before answering. "Because the truth doesn't require the person receiving it to deserve it first," he said. Several months later, Harrington Global released the complete findings of its internal audit to the public, laying out every detail of the scandal without omission or spin. Much of the stolen funds were successfully recovered through coordinated legal action, and the company implemented sweeping structural reforms designed to prevent anything similar from happening again. Family members would no longer receive automatic exemption from routine audits regardless of their standing within the organization. No chief executive would ever again hold unilateral power to terminate an employee who had come forward with a legitimate concern. Every major transaction now required explicit confirmation from a fully independent committee before proceeding, and whistleblower reports were routed automatically to that same committee rather than passing first through executive hands where they could quietly disappear. The changes drew skepticism from some investors who worried the new layers of oversight would slow decision-making. But Victoria argued publicly that a company built on secrecy had already proven how expensive that speed could become. Employees who had watched the scandal unfold from a distance began to speak more openly in internal meetings, no longer afraid that raising a concern might cost them their livelihood the way it had nearly cost Caleb his. Victoria stood before the assembled staff of Harrington Global and publicly apologized to Caleb, acknowledging without hesitation that she had chosen bloodline over evidence when it mattered most. She admitted this mistake openly, refusing to soften it with excuses about the pressure she had been under at the time. Caleb never asked for excessive compensation, nor did he pursue retaliation against anyone who had wronged him throughout the ordeal. Victoria offered to bring him back in a newly created role overseeing integrity and risk management across the entire organization. Caleb agreed only under specific conditions that would prevent history from ever repeating itself. The position would report directly to the Independent Oversight Committee rather than to the chief executive alone. No single leader would ever again have the unchecked power to override or dismiss him without cause. Anyone who came forward with a legitimate concern in the future would receive formal protection under the very framework he now helped design and enforce. Victoria agreed to every condition without argument, understanding exactly why each one mattered after everything they had both endured together. Rowan made a brief appearance at her graduation ceremony that spring, Caleb watching proudly from the audience as she crossed the stage in her cap and gown. Victoria attended as well, arriving quietly without any entourage or press coverage trailing behind her. Afterward, she thanked Rowan sincerely for sharing her father with a company that had, for a time, proven itself entirely unworthy of him. Rowan laughed and warned Victoria not to assume her father forgave easily, just because he appeared calm on the surface. Following the ceremony, Victoria and Caleb sat together at a small coffee shop near campus, the conversation drifting naturally without the weight of titles or corporate formality hanging between them. For the first time since they had met, they spoke simply as two people who had witnessed each other's most vulnerable moments and chosen honesty anyway. Victoria asked whether he still believed family itself was something inherently dangerous after everything his warning had set in motion. Caleb shook his head slowly before answering. "No," he said. "I only believe that bloodline can never replace loyalty." Watching Rowan laugh with her friends across the courtyard, Victoria understood clearly that Caleb had built something far more meaningful than any inheritance could ever provide. A family shaped entirely by love rather than power or obligation. The story closed weeks later when Victoria received a new audit report from Caleb's office, delivered exactly on schedule as it always was now. Written across the cover in his familiar handwriting was a simple line that captured everything the company had rebuilt since that whispered warning first echoed through a crowded boardroom. No exceptions, it read. Not even for the chief executive. Victoria smiled quietly to herself and signed the audit confirmation without hesitation. Caleb Ward had once been fired for daring to speak an inconvenient truth aloud. In the end, that same truth was the only thing that saved Victoria from the family she trusted most, and saved Harrington Global from the very name that had built it in the first place.